They thought they could bully a disabled veteran and his service dog out of the neighborhood with a few threatening letters and a stack of HOA bylaws, but they never expected a federal investigation, a courtroom showdown, and the kind of consequences that would make their powerful management company wish they had simply said, "Welcome home." If you love stories where justice hits back harder than oppression, subscribe now and stay with me until the end, because this one doesn't just expose corruption, it crushes it. I moved into the quiet subdivision 2 months after my final physical therapy session, the kind where the doctor shakes your hand and says you've made remarkable progress, while both of you know progress doesn't mean healed. It just means you've learned to live with the damage, and for me that damage came with nightmares, panic attacks, and a knee that never quite bends the same after the blast overseas, but I had Ranger, my golden retriever service dog trained to interrupt flashbacks, apply grounding pressure during panic episodes, and give me the few seconds of warning I needed before the world started spinning. And when I found the small brick house with the trimmed lawn and the white fence, governed by an HOA managed by Associa, I thought stability was finally within reach, because the listing said, pet-friendly community, and I disclosed everything up front, provided Ranger's training documentation, medical letters, and even offered to meet the board before closing, but they smiled during the walkthrough, shook my hand, and told me they support our heroes, which should have been my first warning, because support that needs to be advertised is usually conditional, and the first letter came exactly 12 days after I moved in, printed on thick paper with the HOA logo at the top, stating that my animal violated the community's breed and size restrictions and that I had 14 days to remove it or face daily fines, and I remember reading that word, remove, like Ranger was a lawn ornament or a broken mailbox, not the reason I can sleep without waking up swinging at shadows, so I called the property manager, a woman with a voice as sharp as polished glass, who informed me that while they appreciated my service, the HOA had a strict no dog over 30 pounds policy and that exceptions set dangerous precedents, and when I calmly explained that under federal law service animals are not pets and cannot be restricted by breed, size, or weight, she responded with a rehearsed line about community standards and told me to submit a formal request for accommodation, which I did that same afternoon, attaching every document again, and for a week there was silence, the kind of silence that feels strategic, and then the fines began. $100 per day for unauthorized animal, posted publicly on the HOA portal where neighbors could see my alleged violations, and suddenly the friendly waves turned into tight smiles, and one evening a board member knocked on my door with a clipboard and told me multiple residents felt unsafe, because Ranger was large, even though he spent most of his time lying at my feet or walking calmly at heel, and I asked her if anyone had actually complained about behavior, and she admitted no, but said perception mattered, and that was when I realized this wasn't about safety, it was about control, because a dog trained to sense anxiety doesn't bark at lawn equipment or chase kids on bicycles, he reads my breathing and leans into my leg when my pulse spikes, and yet they kept escalating, sending violation photos of Ranger sitting on my own porch as if he were trespassing, adding late fees to the fines I refused to pay, and finally threatening to place a lien on my property, and I won't lie, there was a moment. At 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling while Ranger rested his head on my chest, when I considered giving in, because fighting systems is exhausting, and trauma makes conflict feel like combat, but then I reread the Fair Housing Act guidelines and the ADA provisions and realized something critical. They were betting I didn't have the stamina to push back, they were betting on fatigue, and that miscalculation would become their undoing, because instead of arguing with the property manager again, I filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, detailing every letter, every fine, every recorded call, and I sent a parallel complaint to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, attaching screenshots of the HOA portal and a copy of the management contract showing Associa's oversight, and then I waited, quietly documenting everything while the HOA ramped up pressure, including sending a certified letter demanding I attend a disciplinary hearing, which I did, walking into the clubhouse with Ranger at my side, his vest clearly labeled service dog, the board seated at a folding table like a jury of irritated retirees, and the HOA president began by reading the weight restriction rule as if it were scripture, and when I calmly cited federal protections and explained that denying reasonable accommodation is illegal discrimination, she smirked and said, "Our attorney disagrees," and that's when I told them, evenly and without raising my voice, that federal investigators had already acknowledged receipt of my complaint, and the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, because power dynamics change when oversight enters the picture, and for 2 weeks nothing happened. Then a letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from HUD, notifying both me and the association that an investigation had been opened, requesting documentation, board communications, and internal policies, and suddenly the WA portal went quiet, the daily fines paused, pending review, and neighbors who had avoided eye contact began asking what was going on, and that's when the first twist emerged. One elderly woman down the street confided that she had also been denied accommodation for a mobility ramp, told it disrupted aesthetic harmony, and a young couple revealed they were fined for installing a small satellite dish despite federal protections, and I realized my fight wasn't isolated, it was a pattern, a culture of selective enforcement and intimidation, and when HUD investigators requested mediation, the WA attempted to quietly settle with me, offering to waive fines if I signed a confidentiality agreement and agreed not to pursue damages, but by then it wasn't just about Ranger, it was about precedent, and I declined, and the case escalated to the Department of Justice, which began examining whether Associa's regional management practices reflected systemic discrimination, and that's when the second twist hit. Internal emails surfaced during discovery showing board members joking about my fake PTSD excuse, and discussing how making an example of me would deter other special requests, and reading those messages felt like swallowing broken glass, but they also became the backbone of the federal case, because discrimination documented in your own words is hard to explain away, and Associa's legal team shifted strategy from denial to damage control, quietly removing the property manager who had spearheaded the enforcement and issuing a community-wide memo about clarifying assistance animal policies, but the investigation didn't stop, because once federal attorneys detect a pattern, they pull the thread, and the thread led to other communities under the same management umbrella facing similar complaints, and what began as a dispute over a dog transformed into a broader compliance review, and I was called to give a formal statement, sitting across from DOJ attorneys who listened carefully as I described panic episodes, Rangers training, and the chilling effect of public fines, and for the first time in months I felt something close to relief, because the burden of proof wasn't solely on my shoulders anymore, and when the findings were announced, the WA and Associa entered into a conciliation agreement requiring policy overhaul, mandatory fair housing training, monitoring, and financial compensation not just to me but to other affected residents, and the lien threat was formally rescinded, the fines erased, and a public notice posted acknowledging the rights of residents with disabilities, and yet the most satisfying moment wasn't the check or the policy rewrite, it was the day I walked Ranger through the neighborhood and the WA president, now unusually subdued, nodded without speaking, because accountability has a way of quieting arrogance, and the final twist came months later when I learned several board members had been voted out by homeowners frustrated with legal fees and reputational damage, replaced by residents advocating transparency, and the community that once tried to exile us began hosting inclusive events, even inviting a local service dog training group to speak about disability awareness, and sometimes at dusk, when Ranger and I sit on the porch and the sky turns the same color as his fur, I think about how close I came to giving up, how systems rely on silence to survive, and how one complaint, properly filed and persistently pursued, can ripple outward farther than you expect, because crushing Associa wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring balance, about reminding an institution that bylaws do not outrank federal law and that dignity is not subject to majority vote, and if there's anything this fight taught me, it's that justice doesn't always arrive fast, but when it does, it leaves a mark that changes the landscape for everyone who comes after.